All right, welcome to Truth Unto Godliness. I'm your host, Michael, and today we are having a special, well, not episode, I wouldn't quite call it that, but a special conversation. As some of you who follow me on Twitter are aware, I have a keen interest in Norse mythology and have been reading some books about that this summer. And I've been wanting to delve into that topic a bit more, but it's quite hard to say the least, to find well thoughtful adherents of Norse mythology today. I know a few in real life, but I have now had the great pleasure of actually coming to know quite a few here on Twitter as well. And one of them, Sigmar here, has been so kind to offer his time and energy to engage here in a discussion where we will try and talk about some of the critiques against Christianity, which are not that often debated here in the online discussion. And that's, of course, five critiques coming from a Old Norse pagan point of view. So I am very happy and I am very much looking forward to have this kind of discussion. So thank you, Sigmar, for coming on. I think maybe if you want to, you could tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Michael. I really appreciate it. So I guess I can give some background about myself. I grew up in a Roman Catholic family in Appalachia, and I was a believing Catholic really until my college years. I kind of like I went to a Catholic school all throughout grade school, all throughout high school here. It was a liberal Catholic school, unfortunately. So they were making us read liberal theologians like that BLM guy. I can't remember his name. We read like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Our theology teachers made us listen to John Lennon's Imagine. So that was kind of my high school experience with Catholicism, but that didn't drive me away from the faith. What really I got away from Catholicism when I went to college, and in college I became an atheist for a brief time. It was a very cringe period now that I look back on it. Uh, so I was an atheist in college. I would eventually take a hiatus from college, and it was during this hiatus. So we're looking around 2022, 2023, maybe. No, I think it was 2022. That's when I had a real political awakening, and I started seeing all the things that were happening to Europe and to America. And I was I was a very strident atheist at this point. I had lost my Catholic faith, but I became right wing. So I know there aren't that many right wing atheists, but I looked more into Norse paganism, and I really liked what it had to offer. I just couldn't bring myself to believe in the gods. So I basically followed Norse. Sorry. I basically followed Norse pagan morals without believing. I was an atheistic pagan, I guess you could say, until I got invited to go to a moot with some of the pagans here in America. And I went into it skeptical, like, oh, this isn't going to change anything. When people say they have religious experiences, they don't know what they're talking about. But lo and behold, it was during this moot that I felt a connection to the divine, really for the first time. Uh, as a Catholic, I never really felt this experience, but at my very first moot, we were worshiping Frey, the god Frey, and that really changed my whole outlook on spirituality. I am no longer an atheist, thank God now. And yeah, so I'm a folkish Norse pagan, and I practice Asatru.
Could you tell our listeners what a mood is?
Okay, so a moot is a gathering of pagans. It typically has religious connotations, although in modern times it doesn't have to. It can just be a gathering. But typically, when we do a moot, that means pagans are getting together and we're having a blot. And what that is when we pass around the horn with the meat in it after we pray to our gods. And it's one of our main religious rituals in paganism.
Would you say so? Growing up Roman Catholic, would you say was it your political awakening that ended up leaving, making you find your way out of Roman Catholicism, or was it more other considerations that made you become more skeptical of your Roman Catholic upbringing?
I guess so. Going back to the year 2020, for those of you who aren't American, that was the summer of George when we had massive riots all across the U.S. I was on a college campus, and just the anti-whiteism and hatred of white people on these college campuses, it was unbelievable. And the Catholic Church was doing and saying nothing. In fact, they were doing worse than that. They were supporting the protesters in most cases, and I just had no support from the Catholic Church during this time. But I still clung on to Christianity, even though I had severe disagreements politically with the Catholic Church. It was really I was convinced by arguments from atheists philosophically, because I never had that real spiritual connection. I never felt the presence of the divine until my first bloat. So that's what really made me an atheist. But thank God I'm not that anymore.
Now, of course, this is hypothetical, but would you imagine that there would have been a difference had the Roman Catholic Church gone out in a more forceful and clear manner and kind of protested against this kind of racial hatred against European Americans? Do you think a more strong stance from the Roman Catholic Church in favor of also European Roman Catholics would have made a difference for you, or do you just think it was more accidental to your change of opinion?
I don't think it would have made much of a difference, because it might have prolonged me being a Catholic for a bit longer. But I look at Christianity and I don't see a sufficient level of ethnocentrism, even in the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is supposedly the most conservative of the three main kinds. So I really wanted to look for a native European spirituality as I became more politically and racially conscious. And that's what led me to Folkish Asatru.
So, having become Old Norse pagan, and you told us that you had a religious experience here at this ceremony, this blood. I think as a Dane, I think I would translate blood by sacrifice. I don't know if you think that's precise.
Yeah, you could say that.
So, having had this religious experience, what have you also now that I assume you have been a practicing pagan for maybe a couple of years or something like that? Have you also developed your foundation for your religious worldview in more than a religious experience, or would you say that is more or less the core foundation for it?
I guess the real thing you have to do is you just have to uh, develop your relationship with the gods, with your folk, with other pagans, because paganism is really based on relationship and duty. So you have a relationship to the groups you belong to. So if you're a European, you have a duty to further the interests of Europeans. You have an interest to your gods as a pagan. So you have to do bloats. You have to honor the gods, offer them meat sacrifices, uh, and that will. I believe it's that made me feel a connection to the transcendent, combined with just being around other pagans, because I've noticed it's much easier to feel that connection when I'm around others than when I'm all alone. It's not impossible, but it's just easier.
Yes. So if you had, for example, if you met somebody, let's say a secular uh, American European, or somebody inquiring into Norse paganism, um, let's say he had experiences joining in, let's say, some of these communal religious services, but he was still doubtful as to the reality, let's say, of the divine, for example, would you try to point him to some, let's say, objective arguments or considerations in favor of the truthfulness of Norse religion, or is it more of an experienced truth that you kind of have to have some sort of internal experience with?
I think it's more knowledge comes from experience. And like I said, I was an atheist who agreed with Norse morals and pagan morals, but I just didn't believe in the gods until I had felt that actual experience for myself. And after that, I could no longer be an atheist, even if I, for some reason, wanted to, don't know why. But even if I did, like, I couldn't, because I just know there's more to life than just Richard Dawkins materialism. And I even believe in other gods, like the Christian God. I believe in the Japanese kami. I just don't worship them. I worship my gods.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So thinking about how to, let's say, the course of questioning. So I would also say, as a European Christian, that Norse paganism is way more attractive and popular today than it has been historically. I think the new pagan movement here in Europe really took off maybe in the 80s and 90s, because the very earliest attempts of revival, that was before my time, obviously. I was born. I'm less than 30 years old, so I'm not that old. But more or less, like the very early approaches in the 60s were very much influenced by New Age spirituality and didn't really have much to do with Norse paganism at all. But later, more, let's say, attempts to reinvigorate Norse mythology as an approximation of the old faith was actually attempted, and that is, I would say, much more popular in Europe today. Not that we have many Norse pagans, but they are definitely not some very rare phenomena you can only experience online. Let's say they meet up. There are organized Norse religious societies here in Denmark. So one of the reasons why I asked quite a bit into this experiential nature of Norse religion is because, as I'm also certain you are aware, that there are quite divergent interpretations of Norse mythology today.
Yes.
So I had a earlier video where I talked with my friend Matthew about the same, and in that video I more or less divided modern pagans, at least as I experienced them here in Denmark today, into more or less three groups. The boomer pagans, who are not really that religious, but they find Norse mythology cool and native, and they find some sort of deeper, true moral meaning to it, some sort of explanation or foundation for existence. They generally will not believe in the gods as real divine beings, but they more or less see them as stories making sense of reality, so to say. And then we will have in the other group, which is maybe the smallest, maybe the second smallest, I'm not certain, the left pagans. So these will generally be very young pagans who have found it through online consumption of social medias, TikTok, Reddit, and so on. And they tend to be very left-wing pagans, and they not that much in historic continuity with Norse with the Norse thought world and morality, but they will, for example, latch onto figures such as Loki and the way he depicts gender and other sort of, I would just say, like perverted, disgusting ways of dealing with gender, for example, and so that's one group, and then the last group will probably be one fitting you the most, namely traditional pagans who do believe in the gods as real divine beings, and try to pass on the practice of Norse paganism in a way that is in approximation to the actual real faith as it was believed and worked out more or less 1,000 years ago. What do you think about that conceptualization?
I think this is an important thing to bring up because within paganism, one of the things we promote is folkism. I am a folkish pagan. I am not a universalist pagan. So without folkism, your religion means nothing. The functioning of paganism depends upon being folkish. So these left-wing pagans, of course, they would worship Loki and all the perverted shit he does. Uh, Loki is not a good god. We, as traditional folkish pagans, we do not like Loki. Loki worship is forbidden in the Asatru Folk Assembly, which is the group I belong to, because Loki is an evil god. In Ragnarok, he's prophesied to kill Heimdall. He's prophesied to lead the forces of chaos against the Aesir. So, and yeah, the left wing universalist pagans, I can't stand them. They view Loki as like the first transgender guy, and they worship him. And I think he gave birth to Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse. So they're all, the left-wing people are just very perverted, and it makes sense that they would worship Loki, whereas we don't. But sorry, can't speak today. Folkish paganism is what I belong to. And going back to the history of it, I think it's important to trace the history of it because it was actually on the rise in the late 19th and early 20th century with figures like Guido von List around the time of World War I. He published the book The Secret of the Runes. So there was a real folkish pagan movement in Germany, in the Nordic countries. And then after World War II, unfortunately, basically any authentic expression of the European soul was made criminal by this Nuremberg regime that we live under. But in time since then, it has rebounded. It is on the rise again. And I think as just the anti-whiteism and the hatred for Europeans gets ever more obvious in both Europe and America, I think more and more people will be converting. I shouldn't say converting. We are returning to paganism, and I think that's just going to be inevitable as people feel more drawn to their ethnos.
So taking again the role and place for personal experience, how would you argue as a traditional paganist against, say, a leftish pagan, if to some extent both of your religious worldviews are based on this personal experience of the divine? Say, if the leftist pagan says that in his encounter with, let's say, the cult of Loki and the worship of him, he has experienced immense blessings from this god and so on. Then how would you argue? Because it seems to me that there might be some danger of relativism if the personal experience is too heavily emphasized over against some objective grounding for the practice and framing of the religion.
I would point out to them that they are literally worshiping the god who kills Heimdall and leads the Jotun against the Aesir in Ragnarok. And so as pagans, we are loyal to the Aesir and the Vanir. The term Asatru literally means those who are faithful to the Aesir. So it shows that they haven't read. They don't know what happens in Ragnarok, or if they do, they choose to be on the side of the forces of evil, and their personal experience does not reflect what our religion teaches. Just in our sources, in the Poetic Edda, in the Prose Edda. So yeah, I would say that to them. Although I don't think you can really negotiate with these people because their religion really isn't paganism. It's a perverted form of it. Their religion is leftism, and they really just wear a pagan skin suit over that leftism. And that's what I would tell them.
Okay. So if you had Yeah, so just before this is just like, let's say, the final section before we move on to the critiques here in a bit. So if you had to, let's say, present the most persuasive case for Norse paganism for people today, would you point to other things than get out there, try and experience it for yourself? Are there some sort of, let's say, philosophical arguments or deductive arguments for the veracity of the religion? So in comparison, I also grew up as an atheist here in Denmark, as most Danes do. I was also convinced. I was baptized as an infant, but people are raised secular here, and religion is more of a cultural phenomena here in Denmark. But in my very late teens, I had a run-in through some weird ways with Christian apologetics, which I had never experienced before, because the very, very few Christians I had met here in Denmark, they all based their religious persuasion on the feeling they felt it was their truth, or they felt that it was the right thing for them. And I had many difficulties taking such an argumentation seriously, because for me then it more or less just seemed as a sort of religious flavor, like you might prefer vanilla ice cream to chocolate ice cream, but there isn't in any real sense an objective way of saying that the one taste is superior or more real or more true than the other one. And again, from my point of view, it seems, how do you as a Norse pagan base, let's say, the truth of Norse paganism as something more real, more objective than, say, a European becoming a Hindu, for example? I know, sadly, some Danes who are Hindus, or, well, maybe Buddhism is a more popular choice, but if because they will traditionally also found it in some sort of lived experience gained through meditation or yoga, for example. But how do you kind of get beyond that?
Well, I would just reiterate that I think knowledge comes from experience, and so I'm not a rationalist, whereas I just give arguments. And I've heard a lot of Christians actually repeat that as well. Like, they've heard the intellectual arguments for Christianity, but that didn't make them believe. They had to go to church and they had to feel the presence of God, in their words. But I would offer arguments. I would tell them to look at the political situation we're in, and see the importance of folkism, because our people, unfortunately, are just being maligned and attacked at every level. All of our countries are being subject to mass migration, and there's a severe lack of ethnocentrism in the West. And if we are to combat this, we need to be ethnocentric and value our people. So that's what really the meaning of folkism is. We're putting our folk first, and we have a duty to our folk. Like I said, paganism is based on relationships and duty. So I would make those political arguments, but those aren't what converted me, or those aren't what made me a pagan, even when I was an atheist. You have to feel that spiritual transcendence for yourself. And I don't think intellectual arguments really are the best tool for that. At least they weren't for me.
Well, okay, that's perfect, and I think that forms a very nice segue into this, maybe the next, the heart of the conversation here, because I enjoy watching a lot of different content on YouTube. As some of you might know, I apart from being a Christian catechist and doing that as my daytime job, I also work on a farm, and I do my farm business, and a lot of that includes manual labor. So that makes it possible for me to digest a lot of audible material throughout the workday. And I came across your channel through the YouTube algorithm, because I also like to watch, for example, Survive the Jive and a few other pagan channels, and to learn more about my own history and my own culture as a Dane. That's also something that's very important for me. And so I found your video, and I found it very curious because, as we have also talked about in private, there's very little serious and earnest conversation going on between traditional Christians and traditional pagans. And I saw that there was this video, 5 critiques of Christianity, and I was like, that was quite intriguing. So I clicked on it, but I was, I must say, pleasantly surprised, because not only were the critique points, I think, thoughtful, but they were also presented in a very serious and polite manner. So I think maybe, if you want to, we could go through some of those arguments point by point, and I'll let you present them, and then maybe we can discuss them each in some detail.
Sure, whatever you want to do.
So if you want to, maybe you could share why you made the video, or what the goal was, and then maybe share the first critique.
Okay, so and if anyone in the audience hasn't watched the video, I would implore them to watch it after this stream. Of course, don't go away from the stream. But I made the video because I think, like I said in the beginning, I think this dispute is an impasse on the political right, and unfortunately, it causes a lot of vitriolic infighting, which I'm not a fan of. I don't like how pagan and Christian debates just devolve into spectacle. And so I made the video. I wanted to elevate the discourse rather than reduce it to spectacle. And so one of the ways I thought about doing this is, okay, so I want the Christians to know what the pagan critique of Christianity is, but I don't want them to I don't want to be rude. I don't want to cause infighting because at the end of the day, we're all on the same side. We're fighting for the well-being of Europe and America. So I don't go around calling people Christ cucks, for example. I don't think that's good behavior on part of the pagans. Just like I don't think it's good behavior on the part of the Christians to say, "Oh, you're just LARPers" and stuff like that. So I really tried to be as sophisticated as I can, and I'll stop rambling and get into the first point. So my video has 5 contentions, which aren't an exhaustive list. They're just the 5 main ones, in my opinion. And the first one is that Christianity is universalist, whereas paganism is particularist. And so this goes back to what it means to be folkish. You put your folk above all else. You have a duty to your folk because you belong to that group. And in Christianity, I just see a lack of ethnocentrism. And I think when I look around at the state of the West today and how so many white people hate themselves for being white, there needs to be a lot more ethnocentrism in Western societies than there is currently. And I think Christianity, well, there can be based interpretations of Christianity. I don't think it's conducive to that in the way that Asatru is, focus Asatru.
Yeah, so that is very interesting, because I would grant, which seems quite obvious, that nowadays, if you take the mainline denominations, so the large Protestant state churches in Europe, as well as the old large Protestant churches in the United States, as well as the Roman Catholic Church, they are, in no sense of the term, defenders of not either traditional values, Christian morality, or European civilization. And that's quite true. I think my contention would be that they stopped being Christian a long time before they stopped being defenders of the moral order. So that is to say, I think that when Christianity began its decline as a serious thought movement, during the Enlightenment, the era of Enlightenment, where people wanted to de-invest the miraculous and supernatural nature of Christianity from its moral imperatives, then this development really had to continue for quite a while, at least a century or more, before its damaging fruits were brought to fruition. So, for example, to summarize, I think that my point is that the decline we see today more has to do with Christianity disappearing as a serious foundation and defender of the moral order from the political elite and the societal elite. And that happened long before those issues that are plaguing us today began to evolve. So I think that it is not entirely correct to blame it on Christianity, because we see these problems only arising subsequent to the disappearance of Christianity from the political and cultural elites of our societies.
I guess I would respond two things to that. The first is with the latter part. I actually don't think Christianity is completely to blame. I think the biggest thing to blame is World War II and how red subversion and Zionism defeated Europe. But going back to Christianity, I do think there are things baked into Christianity, its universalism, that led the door open to some of the stuff we see today, such as the Christian churches teach that there is neither Jew nor Greek, and that verse is used a lot to justify why churches are not for white people only. Whereas the Also True Folk Assembly, the organization I belong to, you have to be of European ancestry to join. I can't think of a church today that actually, I know if you actually believe in Christianity, then you'll know that the Bible says the races shouldn't mix, that miscegenation is wrong. So it says that somewhere in the Old Testament. But I can't think of a single church that actually enforces that today.
Yeah, so of course, Christianity is a universalistic religion. So we believe that Christianity is the true religion for all ethnicities, for all people and all cultures. But at least from my point of view, this doesn't have to include, as it does today quite often, a diminishment of the importance or the centrality of, let's say, natural states or the citizen's duty to his own people. I think that is very much a modern phenomenon. For example, to come with some historical examples, when Christianity began to spread in the first and second century, we saw very early on the rise of national churches. So, for example, when the Armenians became Christians, they didn't join a, let's say, global universal church, but they founded a Armenian national church in which they used Armenian as their liturgical and sacred language, and they translated the scriptures into their own native tongue. And in a sense, Christianity integrated itself into the national fabric of the people, rather than trying to move the people or to integrate or assimilate them into some larger structure. And the same happened with the Christian Copts, the native Egyptians, and with the Syrians, and with the Greeks, of course, and so on. I think that the earliest traces of Christianity as something in opposition to a national identity would be the framing found in late medieval Roman Catholicism, where because of different political struggles, there kind of was a conflict between a national loyalty, let's say your loyalty as a Frenchman, and a loyalty to France and the French king on the one hand, and then on the other hand, loyalty to God and his representative, namely the Pope in Rome. And I think that is a deficient way and a betrayal of the earliest, not only the biblical ideal, but also the patristic ideal of early Christianity. And it was one of the errors that the Reformation helped to solve, where we returned to this old original Christian approach, where we didn't want to make Christians into some sort of, let's say, global citizen, but we wanted to make Danes Christian or Englishmen Christian, and so on. So Christianity very much became this natural expression of your own culture. And I think that history kind of bears that out. So let's say from the 15th century all the way to, you mentioned the Second World War here earlier. I don't think we saw these dilemmas or these conflicts where you kind of had to either be an Englishman or a Christian. Christianity was quintessentially English in its incarnation as the religion of the English people, and we still see that in the liturgy and the architecture and so on. I don't know if you think that's a fair rebuttal.
I guess I would say to that is you can only have one first principle. So if you're above all else, your thing is I worship Christ, then you can't also put your nation above all else. For pagans, we put our folk above all else. And the reason we worship our gods is because they're the gods of our folk. And I've noticed, I just don't think Christianity has adequate mechanisms to defend the integrity of the European nations. And there's someone in the chat who said Old Testament law isn't applied to Christians. We're not the nation of Israel, so the no race mixing thing is false. And I think that kind of just proves my point, is that the Christianity doesn't have a adequate mechanism to prevent things like miscegenation, and whereas paganism, folkish paganism, it's only restricted to a particular ethnicity. It's particularist. So that's how we manage to prevent those sorts of behaviors. But would you like to go on to the second point, or would you like, I guess, go ahead and rebut that if you want.
Oh, yeah, well, it's just, yeah, so I would agree with the commenter here that parts of the Old Testamental ceremonial laws are no longer applicable to Christians. So I would agree there. But that said, I don't think that either Christianity or even Old Norse paganism would reject race mixing as something intrinsically evil. It might be viewed disfavorably as something to be avoided. But even, for example, when you read the sagas or when you read the Old Norse history, it's full of examples of, for example, Germanic Danes marrying Slavic pagan princes and princesses and so on. And I mean, of course, it depends on how you draw like the line between different ethnicities of different races and so on. But historically speaking, at least from a European point of view, there has been quite an emphasis of a strong difference between Slavs on the one side and Germanics on the other side. So I would see, I wouldn't see Christianity as worse or better in that approach, but I would see Christianity as a very good tool to unite peoples and to make even a national identity spring up. So, as I'm sure you're aware, Martin Luther is not only a huge influence in German culture today and was historically, but when he wrote a lot of his appeals for religious reform in Germany, he wrote it not to, let's say, all the Christian princes of Europe. He wrote to the Christian princes of the German nation, which is quite interesting because even back then, when the national concept wasn't as well developed as it is today, there was still in this very much by religion inspired personality, there was still a very strong consciousness about his duty to his people. And that was in no way in conflict with his duty to God, which he also saw as primary and the most important. So So do you think that? So, well, what I'm trying to argue is that, of course, we need a hierarchy of duties. So I would say, first and foremost, we have our duty to God. And then, second to that, it's to my family. So I'm married, I have kids. And then, thirdly, it's to my people, which is the next group. And I don't think that kind of hierarchy of moral duties is in any way in in contrast to the morality of the Christian Bible. I think we see that explicitly expressed in the New Testament. For example, St. Paul famously says that he wished he could be accursed from Christ. That is to say, he wished he could be damned and go to hell if it meant that he could save his own people, his ethnic people, that is the Jews. And I mean, he doesn't say that about the Greeks, right? He doesn't say that about the Germanics, which is fine. I mean, because he's an ethnic Jew, of course, you want to love your own people more than other people's. Just as I, as a father, I have a duty to love my own son more than any other child here. Even if there is some child who might happen to be prettier, more well-behaved, more beautiful, then still I have a duty to love and care for my own child way more than I have to care for other children, even though I should, of course, also be willing to help them. And the same with peoples. Historically, Christianity has had no issue in saying that, of course, your duty to your own people, it comes before your duty to other people's.
I would definitely agree that you have a duty to your own people before other people's. But from a folkish pagan perspective, we see miscegenation as bad because it destroys both races. In order to preserve your folk, you need to have children with other members of your folk. And so that's why we view it as a very big problem, just as folkish pagans. And in the Voluspa, which is one of the poems in the Poetic Edda, it even distinguishes race within the first like 4 lines. It refers to, I believe, I can't remember the Old Norse term, but it refers to us as the holy folk or the holy kind, one of the two. So
Yes.
I guess that would wrap up point 1, and we'll leave it up to the comments for what they want to make of that. So moving on to point 2, it's that Christianity did not originate in Europe. And when I made this point, I specifically worded it like this. I didn't word it as Christianity is not a European religion, because a lot of Christians would say that Christianity is intertwined with European history, and they would be correct to point that out. So I worded it as Christianity did not originate in Europe. And again, folkism is the main theme here. We want a religion that is authentic to the European biospirit. And in order to do that, it has to originate not only from it has to originate from our people and from Europe. And I think one of the key things here is Christianity views the Holy Land as the Levant, the areas surrounding Jerusalem and Palestine. Whereas for us, our Holy Land is the land of our folk. So Germanic pagan would view Germany as the Holy Land. A Norse pagan would view either Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, Norway as their Holy Land. An Anglo-Saxon pagan would view the island of England as their Holy Land. So that's what we view, or that's what we're saying with this second point. And again, folkism is the main theme here from a pagan perspective.
Yeah, so I would, of course, grant the point and say Christianity certainly did not originate in Europe. But I would take the view, and this is, I'm a Lutheran, of course, as old viewers of the channel will know. But as a Lutheran, I would say that, and I think this is also common to most Christian traditions, at least the historic ones like Roman Catholicism and so on. We would want to emphasize a lot that Christianity is the true and original religion of all mankind. God created humanity; He created the first humans, and the religion they received was the right worship of God. Um, and they continued in worshiping God throughout history. A lot of them fell off. A lot of them ended up corrupting their religions and mixing it with their own beliefs and their own stories and so on. But when Noah, many generations later, left the ark and went out, and his sons repopulated the earth, then I would say that then the progenitors of the European races, they received the religion, the true religion, from him when they went out to Europe. And though it went ended up being mixed and changed as time passed by, I think that Germanic Norse paganism did indeed, and I've talked about that in some of my other videos, it kept some of the kernels of truth in it, and I could use a long time to explicate some of those points, as I've done elsewhere. But I think that I don't really see as a Danish Christian, I don't view my forefathers as being wholly in discontinuity with my religion, because I see them as having carried on certain elements of the truth, and when they were met by the fullness of that truth, they indeed were able to recognize a lot of the elements, which I think is one of the reasons why it was so easy for Scandinavia to become Christianized. Well, maybe not really including Norway, it was quite brutal there, but Denmark, southern Sweden, Iceland, Greenland, and a lot of the Nordic diaspora, Normandy, and the Danelaw in England. In all these places, it happened without fight, without civil wars, without greater conflict. And I think that that is a testament to the way in whereby the Norse pagans saw this as something in certain ways compatible with their own native religions.
Well, I would definitely, and I know you mentioned this in the other stream you did about Norse paganism, is that when Christianity went into Denmark, it took a Danish, it was a Danish expression of it. Like Jesus was depicted as a Nordic man, for example, and you had other examples, and that's true everywhere. Whenever Christianity spread, it took the flavor of the people that adopted it. But, and this is a big however, from a pagan perspective, we don't see it as authentic to the biospirit of, or the soul of the people. Now, let me see what, oh yeah. I guess I would say what is true for the lion is not necessarily true for the lamb, because these are different categories, and nations and peoples are similarly different categories. We may all be Homo sapiens, but there are still immense intrinsic differences between the nations, and that'll manifest itself in the biospirit. So a religion should authentically reflect the biospirit of what, and be the truest expression of that biospirit for whichever people the religion belongs to. So the Japanese, they should be Shinto, for example, because that is a reflection of the Japanese soul. The Greeks should worship Zeus and be Hellenic pagans rather than any other kind of paganism, because that's the expression of their soul. And likewise, the Germanics, we have the Aesir. So I guess that's how I would respond to that as a folkish pagan.
Mm. What would your argument be if I proposed that, having received Christianity, and Christianity having received the Nordic populations for 1,000 years, then the end product very much is a synthesis of the, because of course, as when you look around the world, Christianity looks and feels very different from nation to nation. And I just don't think, when I look at my forefathers in the 15th century, how fierce and adventurous and brave they were in going out and resettling Greenland, for example, or the Nordic Crusades when Christian knights of Denmark went out and conquered the Baltic states and so on. I just don't really see the discontinuity or the conflict between the spirit and at least some of the values. I do see a discontinuity in some values and some views of morality. So I don't want to diminish that. But I don't see in the good things, I don't really see a discontinuity there.
So I guess I would say we have an author named Guido von List in Paganism, and I don't agree with everything that Meister von List says, but one of his core ideas is that there's this thing called the Vehenai, which is usually translated as religion, but it's more like a spiritual language inscribed on the hearts of every Aryan, and it's this orienting moral compass that has always been there and always will be. So even after the Germanic and Norse peoples converted to Christianity, that doesn't mean the Vehenai goes away. It's still in there, and it still orients their perspective, their moral perspective, and the outlook on the world. So that's how when Christianity took a more Nordic or Germanic expression as it went to these areas, it wasn't that hard for these pagans to convert and still have their, I guess I could say, moral outlook. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, I think there's much truth to that, because both because history kind of shows that. I mean, it's funny because many people, at least on a popular level, and this is very common in Denmark as well, that people imagine that Danes were fierce, barbaric Vikings who just went out to rape and pillage when we were pagans, and then when we became Christians, we were all super nice, pacifists who didn't really do anything, and that's just simply not true. Both because it's a caricature of the pagan Danes, but also because it's a caricature of the Christian Danes. I mean, the most successful Viking warriors were the Christian kings who went out and conquered England, and by that time Denmark was a Christian country. So I think you have a point that a lot of the morality, a lot of the culture, it remains unchanged when we became Christians, and I think that some things remained unchanged that should be changed, but also think that a lot of things remain that were good and virtuous, which we have only subsequently lost, and that not due to the influence of Christianity, but due to the influence of I would say cultural Marxism, pretty much, and atheism and rationalism. So I think there's an agreement there, and maybe now or maybe later, another time, it could be interesting to kind of trace out some of these things, because at least my view is that there is no conflict between the nobility of the Germanic spirit, so to say, and the ethos of Christianity.
I would like to recommend a book here while we're on this specific subject, and that's called The Transition from Wotanism to Christianity. It's by Meister Guido von List, and I think that book would clarify a lot of things up for anyone in the audience who might have some trouble understanding what we're talking about, because he shows with examples of how a lot of these pagan institutions and symbols, especially the symbols, and even holidays persisted into Christian times, and the Christians took a lot of inspiration from these pagans in how they expressed their Christianity. So I guess that would do it for point 2. And point 3 is kind of intertwined with it, and that's that Christianity has Jewish roots. I think, well, the pagan argument for this would be Jesus was a Jew. His father was Yahweh, and Mary, his mother, was a Jew, and all 12 of his apostles were Jews. So I don't see how it's possible to argue that Christianity does not have Jewish roots. And in the video, I do steelman the Christian response. I don't equate Christianity with Judaism because the Talmud says some awful things about Jesus, and I'm not saying Christianity is the Talmud. I'm just saying the origins of Christianity do come from Jews.
Yeah, so I think it is true. I mean, I wouldn't deny any of the propositions or facts that you just shared. Those are evidently true. I would just say that it's only a half truth that Christianity has Jewish roots, insofar as Jewish here is only like one step on the line, because the Jews, their roots are traced back to Abraham. And it's Abraham which for Christianity foreshadows the fulfillment of the truth. So when St. Paul argues in Galatians, which is one of his, well, if you have some pagan listeners, I won't just take for granted that everybody's just well versed in Christian scripture, but in one of the very important dogmatic letters of the New Testament, called the letters to the Galatians, St. Paul argues that Judaism, both the people, but also the whole religion, the whole Old Testament, was only more or less a parenthesis, which had a point. It was a taskmaster who was to show us some certain things and to teach us some certain things. But already before there was anything called Judaism, it was only meant as this short transitional phase before the whole nations would gain in this original blessing, which was made to Abraham, who was no Jew himself. I mean, who lived and was born far before he was born of pagan parents that came from Chaldea and with a pagan background, and he forms the essential example of what Christianity seeks to fulfill and to share throughout the world, namely that God will count as righteous those who believe and trust in the Lord. And that was what Abraham did, and he did that centuries before Moses was ever born, centuries before Jacob, the founding father of the Jewish people, was born. And in that way, yes, Christ was an ethnic Jew, and all his disciples were ethnic Jews, and his mother was an ethnic Jew. But he came so as to fulfill this original promise given long before there ever was any Jews, and it was always meant as a religion that was supposed to bring the blessings of God out to all humans. So I don't think there's anything special about the Jews, and as the New Testament is also quite clear about, as the Jews rejected Christ, they were also cut off from the blessings and are now, as St. Paul says, akin to dead branches with no life in them.
Well, from a pagan perspective, we would urge Christians to look at who owns the pornography industry and what are their last names, who are promoting all of these bad things in society, such as interracial marriage, who runs the Federal Reserve, and you'll find the same culprits, and I'll be careful with my words here, you'll find the same culprits behind all of this stuff. And I think I talked earlier about biospirits and how every nation has one. Well, this particular group just has an intrinsic tendency to subvert and destroy other peoples. So that's why we view this particular group as not people to trust. I'll leave it at that. And going back to Abraham, I really have trouble respecting Yahweh as a benevolent God, because he ordered Abraham to circumcise his own son and then circumcise himself. And we view the practice of circumcision as barbaric and gross and morally evil. And especially today, if your audience doesn't know, there is a practice within Judaism where the rabbis, this isn't all Jews, but some rabbis use their mouths to, God, this is so gross. I'll just leave it at that. Whenever a baby is circumcised, rabbis do something with their mouths to that foreskin. So we very much are grossed out, and both morally and just on a physical level, by the practice of circumcision. And so we would levy that charge as another reason why Yahweh is a malevolent God in our view.
I think there's some fair points here, and I think those critiques do have some substance to them, and should therefore also be answered. So from a historic point of view, there was, to say the least, quite a bit of conflict between Christians and Jews. So during the very late Roman era, and especially during the medieval era and the early Reformational period, Jews were not allowed in European societies, and if they were ghettoized. And I don't think, I mean, the charge of Christianity as being anti-Semitic, I do think has some truth to that, and I know some of my listeners might find that very problematic, but as a historic description, then there has been a systematic repression by Christian states historically against Jewish people, and I think for those of especially, I think, and I just want to say that especially for very many conservative right-wing men of our age, and I know a lot of them in real life, they think that the way the general Christian views, for example, the modern state of Israel and so on, as very problematic. But I don't think that should be a reason to leave Christianity, because that is a very much so a new phenomenon. Concerning circumcision, I also think that's very interesting. So in Denmark, there's a strong movement to ban circumcision and make it illegal.
Good.
Which I am in favor of, actually, also as a very conservative Christian. And I am so because circumcision was part of the ceremonial law of the Old Testament, and therefore only meant for a short while. And now that the ceremonial law is abolished by Christ, then there's no need for it anymore. And I also think it's a very brutal practice, and thus it has no what's that called? No way to justify its continuation anymore. And lastly, looking at circumcision, which was, I believe, divinely instituted by God, it wasn't instituted as a blessing or anything good. So the story of Abraham, what leads up to God asking the circumcision, and this is noted by many Christian commentators, it was as a sort of punishment against Abraham, because God had promised him a divine offspring, and Abraham distrusted God, and so did his wife. So rather than trusting God's promise to give him an heir of his own blood and own body from his marriage, he disbelieved God and went into his wife's slave and slept with her, rather than believing in the promise and go sleep with his natural wife. And not to be too vulgar about it, but by his action, he showed that rather than trusting in the fertility of his wife, he trusted in his own members, so to say, and wanted to do it himself of his own power. And therefore God chose to, as a punishment for Abraham, chose to place a permanent reminder of his disbelief on exactly his manhood, because he trusted that rather than the power of God. So I don't think that you as Christians should celebrate or view circumcision as something good or glorious necessarily. It was a just, I think, a reminder and punishment of God, meant for this short duration of time. So I don't think this imputes God's moral character in any way, but I think it shows him as a just judge and avenger.
Well, from the pagan perspective, Odin, for example, would never order this of his European sons, and uh, we just view it as a very malevolent thing for Yahweh to do. And it's bad enough that he ordered this on the innocent child Isaac, but then the fact that he ordered it on all of the Jewish people going forward, at least until the time of Christ, when the old law was dispensed with, that just is the mark of a deity that, in our perspective, we don't think should be worshipped. And so that's, I think, what we can
Well,
talk about.
just a quick question though. Don't you believe or grant that the gods at times imposes collective punishments on people?
Um, there might be an example of that in the Eddas. It's eluding me right now. I'm sure someone in the comments will say it, but if there is collective punishment, I'm not in favor of that. Just on a personal level, I don't agree with that. But especially when it concerns the male member, and especially when it concerns children, that's the worst part. If it's bad enough for adults, but when we're talking about children, that's just a whole level of other gross for pagans. And
Well, what about so I think about Frey, the god of the fields and of fertility and the growth, the I don't know how to say that in English, the fecundity and growth of the fields and livestock and so on. So, for example, when the weather was bad or when famine struck the land and so on, my pagan forefathers would gather together and offer sacrifices to Frey to help reinvigorate the land and to help an abundance of food to return once again. And sometimes they would also practice human sacrifices, as I'm certain you are aware. So they believed and did not have any issues with this sort of knowledge that the gods could withhold blessings from the land so that people would die and starve to death, including women and children as well.
Yes, you are correct that human sacrifice was a phenomenon in every society, even the Old Norse societies. It was a much more barbaric time back then, and I think there has been a lot of moral progress. Whereas pagans today we would not sacrifice our children just because it to the gods. We would sacrifice something else. And I noticed a comment here saying, why is he so hung up on this? Christians don't even do it, referring to circumcision. I have to just answer this. First off, there are Christians who do get circumcised. Maybe not so much in Europe, but certainly in America there are. And this all came from my third point, which is that Christianity has Jewish roots. And I think there's something intrinsic in the character of the people who invented communism and invented Marxism that they can't be trusted. So that's why I am hung up on this, according to that comment. But if you have anything else to say, or if you want to move on,
yeah, just to not to be misunderstood, I don't. I'm actually not aware of Old Norse pagans sacrificing children. They definitely sacrificed adults, but I would. This example of the famine was more so to say that I do think, as part of their religious worldview, Old Norse pagans would not have had any issues with the idea of the gods collectively punishing also believing Norse pagans with famine, with fires, and so on. It's just to
okay, that's a fair point. I can see
yeah,
what you're kind of saying.
yeah, right. So in the same manner, yeah. I mean, I also think it's horrible that infants were punished with circumcision, and I mean, I stand by that. I think that circumcision primarily served as this sort of punitive reminder for the Jewish people. Um, it's horrible, but to be honest, we humans are horrible. We do horrible things, and at the times we deserve punishment from God. And I think that's something that all religions have in common. Plus, I mean, circumcision was also practiced by pagan religions, such as pagan Egyptian times. According to secular scholars, circumcision originated not with Abraham, but with the pagan Egyptians. But yeah, I don't know about that. To be honest.
Maybe that's true. The Egyptians aren't European, so from our perspective, it doesn't really matter.
Okay, yeah, that's
But
fair.
I do think there is a big difference, though, between collective punishment of, say, something like famine, which is bad, but then something involving the male member of a child is much, much worse, in my opinion. So I would just leave it at that.
No,
And
that's fair. Yeah, that's fair.
all right. So the fourth point is that Christianity promotes slave morality, and this is talking about Friedrich Nietzsche, who had who coined the term slave morality. And the verses he got this from, I believe, were stuff like "the meek shall inherit the earth," "turn the other cheek." There's some other ones I'm forgetting, but I'll let you respond to this because I'm actually curious about what the Christian rebuttal to this is.
Yeah. Okay. So I think this is the strongest argument. I do think that. I think that especially the way in which we today are so heavily steeped in this sort of post-enlightenment view of Christianity as essentially a guide to good moral behavior, divested from its supernatural significance, and especially from the original moral context of the religion. So, for example, today, a lot of people, and I will say from the cultural milieu, very much so granted, have a what to say, they view Christianity as this sort of religion with a moral imperative to a very unnatural, unhealthy way of approaching the real world. So, for example, they will take some of the strict commandments of Jesus and universalize those outside of the context whereby they are meant. So to try and frame that in a more concrete manner. So, for example, Jesus says that we must turn the other cheek, that if somebody wants to borrow something from us, we should not only let them borrow it, but be willing to give it up and offer it away and so on. And people will, I think, somewhat justly take these commandments and say, look, I mean, not only is Christianity totally unlivable and it proposes a moral system that can't function in state, but in some manner it's also anti-humane because it will, if you were to follow such morality consistently, I mean, then you won't be able to have a functioning society, a functioning family, and so on. That's my attempt to try and steelman the argument. So I understand the critique. The reason why I still think that it fails ultimately is because it's a one-sided, decontextualized attempt to take snippets of what the Bible says and commands the faithful to do without looking at the whole message. So it's true that we Christians are said we should not avenge, we should not strike back when we are struck, and so on. But that's meant in a specific sense, because the New Testament directly distinguishes between us as private people and then the roles which we have. So, for example, some Roman soldiers came up to John the Baptist, and they asked him, what should we do to inherit eternal life? And he told them not to put down their arms, to follow him out in the desert and be pacifists. But he told them that they could continue being soldiers, only they were not allowed to steal or pillage, and they were to be satisfied with the payment they receive for their warfaring duties. In the same manner, we are told to share our belongings, but we're also told that if a man cannot take care of his own family, he's worse than the Gentiles. Well, worse than the pagans. That's just a way of saying like he's very bad. And I think when you contextualize these verses, it's clear that as a private person, you are required to suffer injustices. You are required um, to be able to have the strength and calmness to be dealt with unjustly, but you're not allowed to do that in any manner whereby you fail your responsibility as, say, a family father, or as uh, in your vocation, maybe as a doctor or soldier or policeman, and so on. So I think that a lot of these critiques falter when you contextualize them, because Christ's ask of us to suffer personally loss, but he does not require us to let others stand. For example, we are not told that self-defense is wrong. It's a duty, because we are we are as individuals full of moral worth, and to allow ourselves willingly to be struck down would be unjust for God, who has called us to certain privileges, and well, not privileges, but to certain vocations, as, say, family father, or with entrusted with some role in society. So I think that when you contextualize these moral requirements, a lot of the forcefulness of the objections fall down, especially when you consider that Christianity historically has not suffered any of these moral issues that we see today, for example. I mean, some people try to defend mass migration to Europe by appeals to some of the stories from the New Testament, and to the ethos of the New Testament, but historically it's just that's a novum, that's very much alien to the Christian tradition, and I think that that historic fact alone should maybe cause us to wonder whether this modern humanistic secular way of using Christian morality as a Trojan horse to open up for certain political priorities is justified.
Mm. Well, I guess the pagan response is, and this is that people will follow things to their logical conclusions. So if they read stuff like "There is neither Jew nor Greek; you are all one in Christ," "The meek shall inherit the earth," "Love your enemies," "If you want to follow me, sell all of your possession," they will take that to their logical conclusion, and it will ultimately lead to the destruction of Europe. And I think that if Jonathan Bowden, who is probably my favorite, not just pagan intellectual, but just intellectual in general, if he were alive today, he would certainly be making this case. He would say that wokeism, the phenomenon of wokeism, with all of the self-hatred for being white, it comes from Protestant Christianity, specifically English and American Anglo-Protestant Christianity, not so much Danish, but Protestant nonetheless, because whereas Protestantism talks about original sin, you inherit an original sin from Adam, who ate from the tree in the garden, even though you didn't do that. The woke people would say you inherit a guilt for being white, and that you need to self-flagellate yourself for being white. And just as like how some of the Puritans in America, for example, they would take whips and self-flagellate themselves. And I'm sure anyone can go on YouTube and just see Southern evangelical American Protestant pastors talking about how, quote unquote, they are worms and they are nothing without God. And all of this is just antithetical to paganism. From a pagan perspective, we don't have this guilt We don't believe in original sin, and we strive for what Nietzsche called master morality, which is the will to power, the asserting of your own will, and striking back if someone strikes you. We actually view it as a very dishonorable thing if you do not strike back if someone slights you. So, from a pagan perspective, we think some of that Nietzschean vitalism would be good to have. Even if Europe it remains Christian, I would rather it be a more vitalistic Christianity than this kind of limp-wristed Christianity that I see so much in America, and some in Europe, but a lot of it in America.
Yeah, so I think this is really some of the meat here of both some of the agreements and some of the disagreements. So to try and take it in the reverse order, I tried to make some notes here because I think you pinpoint a lot of the concrete examples and some of the good concrete counter arguments against the Christian case. So I just wanted to maybe address some of those. So concerning original sin, yeah, that is a for many people justly very provocative article of faith, that we believe that all humans have before God, through no personal fault of their own, no justice before him. And this is a doctrine common to all Christians, both Roman Catholics, all sorts of all Protestants and so on. But I think that the way in which you presented here and the manner in which some Christians presented is without any connection to the historic or the biblical doctrine. So it is true that we argue that we are, in the sense, all guilty before God through no fault of our own, not because we believe that we personally did something wrong, but because we believe that we lost the original justice that humans had prior to the fall. And again, this is something common to all Christians, but then the message of Christianity is exactly that. In Christ, this original sin is forgiven. So, having been baptized and believing in Christ, you're no longer guilty of original sin. You don't no longer have original sin. So, this sort of very very destructive Christianity, in which you can see nothing beautiful, nothing good in yourself, is something I would argue that is very foreign to both the Roman Catholic tradition, to the Protestant religions, and here I would include the historic Reformed tradition, Anglicanism, and Lutheranism, because we all confess that in baptism God dwells and takes residence in the believer, and that real habitual sanctification happens, whereby the believer can grow in virtue and in justice also before God. And we will explain that differently, of course, and have our serious disagreements here, but we all confess that takes place. So there is something good and true and beautiful within man. So I think that correctly understood, this doctrine in its historic presentation does not really leave room for this specific criticism. And these examples of Christianity, you mentioned some Bible verses here earlier. For example, there's no longer Jew or Greek, no longer male and female, no longer free or slave, but we all one in Christ. This is explicitly about salvation, because Christ, St. Paul, who writes this, says just after in the following verse that this is about salvation. And as you know, I mean, no Christian has ever believed that either racial, ethnic, or gender differences disappear in the church. So, for example, all historic Christians have said that the priesthood is reserved for males alone, and nobody has ever thought that, at least historically, prior to, let's say, the 20th century, nobody thought that this verse saying that there's no longer male or female in Christ meant that it had to do with anything other than salvation specifically. He is only arguing that salvation is for everyone, but we are still males and females, we're still Greeks and Jews, and so on. And we can also, and I think this is important, we can treat people differently. We can treat women and males differently, and we can also treat different cultures differently. I think it would be unjust for Christians to demand that in a mixed congregation that you should treat everybody equally, because people have different sensibilities and different cultures and so on. So I think it's only good and fair to treat people differently. And it's the same with the meek shall inherit the earth. I could talk long about that, but at least this, when Christ says that we should sell our belongings and follow him, I think this verse is also better understood in its context. So it's about the rich man coming up to Christ and asking him, how should I inherit eternal life? And Christ says that you have to obey the law. And then the text says, quite interestingly, and the man sought to justify himself. And then he says that he has obeyed the whole law. There's nothing he's at fault with. And of course, this is a very naive approach, because nobody can perfectly obey the law of God. So Jesus says, okay, right. So if you have obeyed all of God's law, and if you want to be perfect, then sell all that you own and come and follow me. And of course, this man being very rich won't do that, because he loves his belongings. So this is not Christ trying to say that Christians shouldn't own private property. I mean, the Bible says that King David was a man after God's own heart, and he was a royal king and very rich, so there's nothing wrong with personal private property. But Christ here is trying to show this very prideful man that he is not perfect before God. And that's the point of the passage, not that we shouldn't own private property. And I think that my point here in general is that when we look at these problems or passages in context, I do not think that the critiques are quite as strong as they sound on the onset.
An interesting view. I would just again say that people follow things to their logical conclusions and generalize them. So even though you're totally right that the Bible has King David owning property and he didn't sell all of it, but the subversive types will use that. And I think this is getting to an important point, is that pagans just don't see sufficient mechanisms to prevent this subversive brand of Christianity that may not be the true Christianity that someone like yourself practices, but nevertheless, it's the Christianity that you get taught in like the Catholic schools I grew up in, or in just American Sunday Protestant churches they always find a way to agree with the political left to the detriment of Europeans and Americans. So I guess on the note of subversion, that would bring us to the fifth point,
Well,
unless you had anything else to say.
Yeah. Just before we continue, just draw a very short parallel here. Just to summarize, I think I would argue that it's essentially the same thing going on when leftish pagans take out snippets out of the original context, like Loki, and view him as the first transgendered person, as a gender bender, and so on. And from your point of view, you can see these people are in no historic continuity with our faith. They are taking things out of context and making interpretations of the myth that run contrary to the whole of the whole corpus of the religion. As you mentioned, Loki is the betrayer of the gods, and he's punished by the Aesir and so on. So that's true, and I would say that example is totally parallel to these sort of undermining figures who are, I would argue, not Christians, but seeking to misuse and to pervert Christianity. They are heretics, frankly, and I would say that we can prove that this is not the logical end or conclusion of Christian morality, because for 1,800 years nobody thought that this was what Christianity meant. It is without any precedent in the Christian tradition, even though we have a lot of different Christian traditions. And I would grant you, a lot of the large mainstream religions today are fallen with respect to many of these things. But that is because they stopped being Christian, and they did so in many cases more than 100 years ago.
Well, I think that segues us nicely into point 5, which is, I can't remember how I phrased it in the video, but it's basically that the churches are subverted. And I'm glad you mentioned that these people pushing leftist Christianity are heretics in your view, because I included 4 examples of subversion in the church on a slide in my presentation. One of them was the Pope. He was kissing the foot of a sub-Saharan migrant into Africa. And recently, he's also issued statements saying that it is a grave sin to reject migrants or to treat them unjustly. So the Pope, of course, I know you're Protestant, but the Pope is the leader of the Catholic world, and the Catholics have an obligation to listen to him theologically. It's hierarchical. He is the Father. He is the Vicar of Christ on earth. So subversion is not just Pastor Bob in Arkansas who's pushing this. It's the highest levels of the church. And then this manifests in other situations, like something else I included in the video. There's this guy named Ryan Turnipseed. I think he follows you on Twitter. He was a former member of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in America, which is supposed to be the conservative branch of Lutheranism here in America. And they excommunicated him because he was holding them to real Christian dogma. From what I understand, he was totally right, and the LCMS was totally in the wrong, doctrinally speaking. But that didn't stop them from excommunicating him. And you can clarify if I'm wrong about this, but doesn't excommunication carry grave consequences for the soul?
Yeah, certainly it does.
So they excommunicated this guy who's totally in the right about what he was saying. And I think that's just horrible, especially if the consequences are potentially damnation. This ostensibly right-wing branch of Lutheranism is doing this to their own actual true Christians. That's just deplorable to me. So subversion, it's not just fake Christians or atheists who want to construct a liberal Christianity for their own political purposes. It's the Christian leaders such as the Pope, such as the Matthew Harrison of the LCMS doing that to Ryan Turnipseed. And I know you don't agree with that, so I'm not accusing anyone such as yourself of pushing this Christianity. I'm just pointing out that the mechanisms, that whatever mechanisms were in place, did not succeed in preventing this stuff.
Yeah, so I think those are some 2 good tangential examples of the conflicts going on. As you mentioned, of course, I'm Protestant, so and Lutheran at that, and we are kind of famous for our critique of the papacy, to say the least. So I won't
a justified critique. I might
yeah, right, yeah, and of course I would say so as well. But to try and defend my Roman Catholic friends here, I would also say there has been a strong backlash, especially against Pope Francis, because he has done and said things both concerning Christian morality, but certainly also regarding Christian doctrine that has been incredibly scandalous to the faith. And many Roman Catholics are straight out saying that what he has said and done indeed amounts to heresy. Now, Roman Catholics, of course, want to try and distinguish between his official teaching capacity and his private opinions, but I will leave them to that. But it's to say that for many Roman Catholics, they are also trying to fight back against this influence. But as a Protestant, I would say, yeah, he's just dead wrong. Of course, there is. Not only is it not morally evil to turn away mass migration, but it can actually be gravely sinful to allow it, especially considering the consequences of mass migration to Europe. So there's not much to add there. Regarding Ryan, I have talked personally to Ryan before, but I must say I'm actually not. I don't know exactly what he was excommunicated for. So in a Lutheran context, excommunication means that you're no longer allowed to receive Holy Communion anymore, and that's a serious thing. Now, we won't say that somebody who is excommunicated is damned. That would be a more Roman Catholic view, but it is certainly a serious thing, and I can't imagine what he would have done or said that would have warranted such a punishment. Now, I did see one of the commenters saying that he has been readmitted to the Missouri Synod. Again, I don't know. I actually haven't followed that case, but I do know that there have been some discussions and some struggles in the Missouri Synod regarding some of the political some of the questions of a more political nature within the synod. And I think this is just my exhortation. I think we should be extremely cautious to excommunicate or to try and sanction ecclesiastically people with unpopular political views. I mean, only if we can prove that they are heretics and going against the faith should they face any sort of ecclesiastical sanction. And I haven't seen that in that case. But to your point, yes, a lot of Christian churches have been subverted. But I think that we shouldn't really be too surprised at that, because at large our populations have. So, for example, I will speak about the Danish example because it's the one I'm the most familiar with. Denmark and the Danish state church has around 90% of ethnic Danes as its members. Almost none of them are Christian. Very small minority of the members of the Danish state church are Christians, but the vast majority of ethnic Danes are members. That means, I mean, unsurprisingly, that the church, the values of the Danish state church, don't spring from Christian scripture or historic Christianity, but it springs and is informed by the values and the worldview of the majority of Danes. And what's that? That is just very secular, left-wing, radical ideology that men can become women, that women can become men, that you can inject hormones into small children, that homosexuals can be married, and so on. That's what's practiced and preached in the Danish state church. And again, it doesn't have anything to do with that being like the national logical conclusion of Christianity, but it has to do with a church that's a church almost only in name and not informed by the Christian people. And I would say the solution to this for Christians, and that is practiced by many Christians, is for Orthodox believing Christians to reject church fellowship with these liberals and to form good, solid church bodies that are not in communion with manifest heretics. And that's also what we're seeing, at least many places in Europe and the States.
Well, it's good to hear that if that's true, that Ryan Turnipseed was let back into his church, because that was an unjust excommunication from what I understand it to be. Responding to the Catholics, I'm not going to push this on you because you're a Lutheran, obviously, but I really only accept Catholics who argue that Pope Francis isn't teaching the right religion if they're sedevacantist, if they deny that, or if they think that the seat of the Vatican is empty. Because I think Pope Francis, you can't call him a true Catholic in any sense of the word. He's not teaching Catholicism, and he's actively leading to the destruction of Europe by aiding and abetting mass migration. He'll never talk about anti-whiteism. He'll never talk about how people of European descent are attacked in the streets and discriminated against in both Europe and America. But he'll talk all day about how we need to accept refugees, and he goes around and kisses the feet of sub-Saharan migrants into Europe. So I really do not like Pope Francis, and it's hard for me to take Novus Ordo Catholics seriously for that reason. I would just add this, from the pagan perspective, our organizations are folkish, so that means we only accept people of a particular folk, which is white Europeans. So, and if, for example, the AFA, which I'm affiliated with, if you do something against the rules in the AFA, then they will gatekeep you out. So, for example, homosexuality is not allowed within our organization. So if you were a homosexual, then you would be promptly booted out. And I think that's very important. And it shows that the AFA has mechanisms against subversion. And I think gatekeeping is the key mechanism. And if Christians can just gatekeep against subversion and not tolerate it like they have been, I think that would help not just Christianity as a religion, but also just Europe and America.
Yeah, so speaking as a Lutheran, of course, we would say that we would not distinguish between, we would not put limitations regarding ethnic background on membership in our congregations. We would welcome everyone, but we would also want to distinguish the things concerning religion and the church service from political considerations. So, for example, we can have, as Christians, we can licitly disagree about, for example, tax laws. I mean, I think it's totally fair for some Christians to support a welfare state as we have in Denmark, and I think it's totally fair for Christians to support a more um, more um, a more strict society without social welfare, where personal responsibility is more heavily emphasized. That's totally fair. In like manner, I also think that we as Christians have a duty to care for our people and country and nation, and therefore it's totally fair for Christians to say like we shouldn't have immigration to Denmark. We should keep Denmark a homogeneous national state of ethnic Danes alone. But I just think that as a Christian, we can distinguish between these two realities and say, even though we won't bar anyone from church membership concerning his or her race, it's a totally licit and valid discussion politically whether we want this immigration or not. And I don't think that any Orthodox Christian have ever had an issue with that way of framing it, because frankly, I mean, I'm quite right wing. I don't think Denmark should ever become a multicultural state. I think mass migration is horrible and destructive, and it's something that I fight against. But I mean, that's a discussion I also have with other Christians naturally, and I just think it's helpful to try and differentiate between these two, because there is a certain threshold. For example, when Pope Francis said that it was sinful not to allow migrants, then he moved outside the realm of, let's say, licit politically disagreements, and he moved into the area of heresy, because that is a heretical statement, because it's a statement about the what constitutes sinful acts, and that's a theological question. And that is a very mistaken reply he gave to that question. The same with his teachings on the death penalty, for example. It is not congruent with historic Christianity or biblical morality to call the death penalty an inadmissible violation of human dignity. So again, I think if normal Christians just became more historically aware of the historic practices and views and values of their faith, then we could resolve a lot of these issues.
I guess I can see where you're coming from. As folkish pagans, obviously, we would take that extra step, and we don't allow non-whites in our organization. But I can see your point, and as long as my whole objective is politically is to save Europe. I want Europe to exist, and I want it to be for the Europeans. So that's my only objective, and I think a serious embrace of ethnocentrism is needed to do that. I personally think folkish paganism is the best way to accomplish that, but all the respect to the Christians who do promote a more ethnocentric Christianity and who oppose these things like mass migration. So really, at the end of the day, this I hope the audience saw that this isn't a real debate. It's more of a discussion between two fellow men of the West who want to see the West exist, basically, and not be multicultural.
Yes. So, there's one. Before we jump to the Q&A, I'll just allow you to maybe, if you want to share some concluding thoughts here on the 5 points.
Sure. So I would reiterate that folkism is the key word. We are folkish pagans, and we are ethnocentrists, and we want to see our race survive. That is our whole raison d'etre, and it's why we are Germanic pagans, is because we belong. We are of Germanic descent. I'm personally of German and British descent. Some other people are from Scandinavian descent, but it's really all just one family. So folkism is the main takeaway for any Christians who maybe didn't know much about paganism. And I would reiterate that within paganism, there is relationships and duty. We are not atomized individuals. We exist in a web of relationships. And with that, intrinsically comes duty. So we have a duty to our race, we have a duty to our family, we have a duty to our gods, and we have to be the best people we can, not just for ourselves, even though we want to construct the best lives possible for ourselves, but more importantly, we want to construct the best lives or the best state of affairs for our people. And that's what it truly means to be a folkish pagan.
And I think we as Christians could agree that we have a duty to our people and to our nations that raised us. I would just end with, I think one nice example of that is actually the medieval philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas, who will be well known to all my Christian listeners at least, but it might even also be well known to some of the pagan listeners here. He wrote in the 13th century that in his great theological tome, the Summa Theologiae, he wrote that man becomes a debtor to other men in various ways, according to their various excellences and various benefits received from them. On both accounts, God holds first place, for he is supremely excellent, and is for us the first principle of being and government. On the second place, the principle of our being and government are our parents and our country, that has given us birth and nourishment. Consequently, man is debtor chiefly to his parents and his country, after God. Wherefore, just as it belongs to religion to give worship to God, so does it belong to piety, in the second place, to give worship to one's parents and one's country. The worship due to our parents include the worship given to all our kindred, since our kinsfolk are those who descend from the same parents, according to the philosopher Aristotle. The worship given to our country includes homage to all our fellow citizens and to all friends of our country. Therefore, piety extends chiefly to those. And that can be found in the second part of the Summa Theologiae, question 101. I think this is very interesting because it's a good historic example of what I take to be this very natural Christian sense of duty to God, parents, and country. Because even more so in the Latin text, of course, as you know, the word he uses for our country here is patria, which means fatherland, from pater, which means father. And the word he uses from people for kinsfolk is consanguineous, which means people of the same blood. So even back in like medieval Christian Roman Catholicism, you had a strong idea of the natural respect and duty you had to God first and foremost, but then secondly after that to your family and to your people. And I just want to end on that one note of agreement, because I do think there's some significant agreement there, even though, as I must also say, there are some areas of actual disagreement, such as how strong of a line we want to draw, because as a Christian, we would, of course, also include people of other races and other peoples. But I just wanted to add that as a what I think interesting historical example.
That's fair.
All right, so some questions. If people in the comments want to throw some in, otherwise I'll go through some of the questions, some of the comments there are a few that are quite interesting. Here's one of the earliest one. Have you read Against the Galileans by Julian, the Roman Emperor, also known as Julian the Apostate by Christians?
Is my audio okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, good. Something went weird there. So no, I have not read this book. I would very much like to read it. The philosopher Savitri Devi dedicates a book she wrote to the Emperor Julian, and I view the Emperor Julian as a hero for Hellenic and Roman pagans.
Yeah, okay, interesting. I did read it some years ago. I didn't really. The only thing I remember about it was some of the exegetical arguments from scripture were kind of odd, but otherwise, I sadly can't think too much of it. Let's say some other questions here. All right, so somebody here asks, can we not say that miscegenation is wrong without a specific religious prohibition? There's no command to not remove fingernails, but we should not do that either because it is practically bad for us. So as a Christian, I would say, I think that historically at least, it has just been unnatural for people to marry outside of their own group and own people because of the practical considerations. So yeah, I think there has been a strong bias against the practice, which also explains why it's pretty much only within the last 100 years that it has become widespread, even though in many countries Protestants have lived with other peoples there were at least comparable to now, very little mixing going on. But I think you would take a stronger stance here, right?
Yeah, completely. It is disgusting. It is an abomination. And the reason for that is because it destroys both races. You can't keep your race going if there is miscegenation. So we want to see Nordic people exist. And if a Nordic woman is with a sub-Saharan African, that child will not be Nordic. And we want our people to exist. We don't hate the other races. Let's make that very clear. We love our own, and we want our own to exist. And so, seeing something like that, seeing a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Danish woman with a son of Africa is just beyond disgusting to us. And my critics can clip that.
Yeah. So, as a Christian, of course, it's difficult for us to say something is sinful when there's no explicit divine commandment against it. But I do think there could be some arguments against it from a more secular point of nature, such as, for example, whether it would be unwise to do.
Can I add something here? I would like to say that we are very, as humans, we like to conserve our animal species the way they are. We don't want animal species to go away because we like having that human biodiversity. And I think the same thing applies for humans. A lot of conservationists and environmentalists will talk all day about how we need to save this particular species or kind of animal. But when you extrapolate that out to humans, then apparently you're the most evil person in the world. So I like to use that example too. I'm in favor of, I'm on the side of life, and I want to see things preserved.
Yeah, one example I often use, because I would say I also think it's unwise to do. And one of the reasons that I would point towards is that I believe that this human diversity is part of God's design. So to work contrary to that, it would be to not really be in tune with this part of the multifacety of creation. And therefore I think some critique could be leveled against it. But practically speaking, I just think it's unwise to do, because oftentimes divorce rates and very many other social ills follow from this practice as well.
Absolutely.
One interesting comment here, and I was hinting to this earlier, because I would say that historically paganism has never been against mixing of people here. David says here in the comment that I mentioned some examples from the medieval and Old Norse period prior to Christianity, where it was very common for Germanic pagans to intermix and marry with Slavic pagans. I don't know what your view of that is.
Okay, I'm actually glad you put this on screen. So, Mr. David Johannes, this is a difference between America and Australia and the Anglosphere compared to Europe. It's that Europeans view the word race more akin to ethnos, and that's originally what the term meant. So you had the German race, you had the French race, you had the Spanish race, but Americans use it in a different way. Americans, we interpret it more broadly as there being one umbrella white race. My personal view is that there is not one white race. There are many white races. So, with regards to Slavic people, I do consider them as part of the European family. I don't consider them as Asiatic people. Although in the Kazakhstan, you can see people who are more Asiatic in appearance. But I would like to point out that the Varangians were Swedish princes of Russia. And you can go to Russia today and still find people who are tall, pale, blonde hair, blue eyed. And same thing for the Finns. The Finns actually do not come from the Aryans and the Caucasus, but they look more. I mean, they're obviously all white, blonde hair, blue eyed. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So the point I want to make to this person is I do take a more broad definition of the white race. So I don't see like a Scandinavian marrying a Slav from Belgrade, for example, as miscegenation. I'm talking about if a Danish woman married a Nigerian.
Okay, so here I think that might be some disagreement then, because I think it's problematic when Danish culture and the Danish ethnicity disappears because we intermarry with, you mentioned, Africans. I think that's wrong and should be avoided. But I equally think it should be avoided that the Danish ethnicity and the Danish culture should become extinct because we all married Poles or other Slavic groups. So, for example, as I'm certain you're aware, when the Germanic tribes came down and conquered huge swaths of Europe, when the Swabians settled in Spain along with the Vandals, and when the Langobards came into Italy, and when the Franks came into Gaul, and when the Goths came into the Balkans, none of these areas are Germanic today. And all of these ethnic groups died out and became extinct because of race mixing. And I think
I can totally see how you would say that as a Danishman. And again, you're totally in your right to say that. I just take a broader definition because in America, with this particular issue, it is very bad here. And I want to see all Europeans exist, and I want to see our phenotypes exist. So that's why I take a broader example, but you are totally fine to take a stronger definition than I do.
Yeah, because as a European, the category white doesn't really mean anything to me. I would feel strange, and as a foreigner, if I lived among Bulgarians, for example. I don't really have any relationship or familiarity to them. So as a Christian, I think it was sad and wrong for, let's say, the Gothic Christians to disappear. I think the world is a bit poorer because of the disappearance of these people.
And I should say, my view, not all pagans agree with me on that. That's just my personal view. But yeah, So that's my personal opinion. That doesn't represent paganism.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. Well, not really a question, but I think this is interesting also to do with some of the innate sensibilities of different people. While I would say it's obvious, but of course, biblical, confessional Lutheran Christianity is true for all people. But I do think there was something about some of the cultural sensibilities that caused at least all the Germanic peoples, almost without any exceptions, to become Protestants, while it was very difficult more difficult for the Slavs and the Latin speaking peoples to accept it. I mean, there's a lot of historical and religious and cultural reasons for this as well, but I do find it curious that almost all Germanics became Protestants so quickly.
Well, I think Protestantism and Lutheranism particularly speaks to the Germanic and Norse soul more than Catholicism does. And I believe you made a similar point in your other stream about paganism, and I totally agreed with that.
Yeah.
It would be hard for a Spaniard, for example, to become a Lutheran just because Catholicism is so ingrained in the history of Spain, going back to the Moors and the Moorish conquest. So, yeah, I understand why a lot of Germanic people are Protestant rather than Catholic.
Oh yeah, this is also an interesting point. I think there is a sort of poetic beauty that is often overlooked because, I mean, of course, the New Testament is very much a Jewish text, and of course, it's about Jews in the Jewish setting and so on. But isn't it curious that the first people who come to worship Christ are the three magi who come, and they're all non-Jewish pagans. None of the Jews come to worship Christ when he's born, but three pagans, Gentiles, come and do that. And at the crucifixion, the first person to confess the divinity of the Lord was a Roman European. So I do think that though some people who have, I think, a unhealthy view of Old Testament Judaism can try to diminish unjustly the way in which Christianity and early Second Temple Judaism intertwine, then likewise also think, and maybe that might be the more common problem for our people today, is that people also try to make Christianity too ethnocentric concerning Jewish people, when literally the first and the last guy to confess the divinity of Christ in his earthly life was pagan, and one of at least some of them Europeans as well.
Okay, so Mr. Chemnitz, if that's his name, if you go back to my video, I make painstaking effort to steel man the Christian position, and I do not claim that Jesus was friendly to the Pharisees, because he obviously was not. He knocked over the tables when he saw how the Jews were running the temple. The Talmud says that he's boiling in semen right now in hell. He called, in Revelation, I believe, he calls the Jews the synagogue of Satan. So I'm not saying he was playing favorites with his people. I'm saying the roots of Christianity come from this particular group, which invented communism, which invented the pornography industry, and a various slew of other bad things. And that's the broader point I was trying to make. It's not European.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. This is something I don't know much about, but Kaiser Naderex here argues that the historic practice of circumcision is quite unlike the modern practice of circumcision. This is actually something I don't know anything about, but I do know that a lot of rabbinic Judaism has absolutely nothing to do with historic Old Testament Judaism. So there's that.
Well, I can't speak much to this, but I do know there is a practice within Judaism, that theistic Judaism, that has a name. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it involves a rabbi sucking on the foreskin of a baby, and it's disgusting. And so I have problems with circumcision.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I mean, no European Christians get circumcised. Maybe you're an American, so you probably know this better than I do. But isn't it a recent phenomena from the, I don't know, the 20th century for medical reasons that for some odd reason circumcision became common among European Americans?
Yes, actually, it's said that circumcision is actually healthier for the baby. I disagree,
Mm.
but this comment is correct that Americans are the ones who are getting circumcised. Not really, it's not really a big thing in Europe, and I think that's correct. Yeah, you
I
agree
mean,
with
I've
me.
never seen a European man who was circumcised, unless he was not European.
Yeah. It's an American phenomenon, unfortunately.
All right, so let's. Somebody disagreed with me about circumcision being a punishment. I think there could be a fair discussion about that, but I don't really think this is the place for that. Let's see if is there anything else. Otherwise, I really think this was a very enjoyable and great conversation.
I certainly enjoyed it. You are a very well spoken and friendly Christian, and I appreciate that. So I try not to be combative and vitriolic towards Christians because I want to foster a united brotherhood against the enemies of the West.
Yeah, and I mean the decline and degeneracy of the West is
Absolutely.
sadly way too common. I just think it's. I think I know some pagans in real life here in Denmark as well, and I think that the pagans that I know and think we can have some meaningful cooperation with is exactly those that confess objective morality and the reality of a divine cosmic order of the universe and so on. And already there we stand as useful allies against a mainstream culture that is increasingly more and more hostile against any sort of natural, traditional living, a healthy culture of life, celebrating families and natural gender roles and native culture and so on. So I think it's important. It's important to talk about our disagreements as well, but I also think it's very important to cooperate on those points where we do share a common ground.
Yeah, my only ops are Zionists. It's not the Christians.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think Martin Luther wrote a few things about that as well.
He's totally right. I agree wholeheartedly with what he said.
But that is also something that's controversial among some Christians as well. But then again, what isn't? Well, I think it could be interesting to talk with you another time as well, especially regarding the nature of. Well, maybe I'll definitely send you a private chat about this as well. But I find it intriguing how metaphysically pantheism can work. But yeah, that's a niche problem. I will just thank you so much for being so generous with your time and for talking about all these interesting things. I hope it has been beneficial to our viewers and also stand as an example of two people who, though having strong disagreements as well, can still have a fruitful and polite and edifying conversation.
Absolutely. Like I said, you represent the kind of Christian I respect. I get some mean comments from Christians, and some which don't really annoy me, but what annoy me are stupid comments, not mean comments.
Mm.
But I have immense respect for thoughtful Christians such as yourself. And if I may just shill my channel here for a bit,
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely do that.
I started my channel back in February of this year, and I'm trying to grow it. Even though we were talking about religion and paganism, Christianity in this stream, that is not the main focus of my channel. The main focus of my channel is subversion-free education from a rightist perspective. I have started a world history course, which is available for free on my channel. Just got out the first lecture yesterday, actually. So like 40% of my audience are Christians. I did a poll. So I have a very mixed audience of both pagans, Christians, and even some atheists too. So if that interests you, if you are interested in right-wing books, a world history course, or even religious matters, I encourage you to come over to the channel, and we'd be glad to have you.
Excellent. Yeah, that sounds super interesting. Thank you for also presenting your channel. I have seen a lot of your book reviews. They're very, very interesting and good as well.
Thank you.
And nice of you to take one for the team and read through some of these old, more niche works as well. Well, I think I'll just end by saying God bless to our listeners, and you might say the gods bless. I don't know if you use that.
May the gods guide your path. Hail the folk.
Thank you, and